Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carla Ituri, and on behalf of Carahsoft Technology Corporation, I'd like to welcome you to our Gimmal webinar, Maximizing Efficiency, Minimizing Data Sprawl and Storage Through Effective Data Management and ROT Cleanup. To tell you a little bit about Carahsoft, we are a trusted government IT solutions provider delivering software and support solutions to federal, state, local, and education customers. Carahsoft maintains dedicated teams to support sales and marketing for all of its vendors. Our contact information will be at the end of the presentation, so please don't hesitate to call or email us for any of your needs. This webinar is being recorded again, and a copy of the presentation will be emailed to you. I'd like to introduce our speakers for today's presentation. Rick Wilson, Senior Product Manager at Gimmal, and Jeff Tujetsch, Sales Engineer at Gimmal. With that, I'd like to turn it over to our first presenter of the day, Rick. Thank you.
Hi, Carla. Thanks so much for inviting us to join you today on the webinar. It's delighted to be here, and thank you all for attending. As Carla mentioned, I am a product manager. I work mostly with our information governance tools at Gimmal, and I'll give Jeff a moment to introduce himself so you're familiar with his voice.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jeff Tujetsch, and as it says, I'm a sales engineer at Gimmal, and I also, with Rick, specialize in information governance.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. So just a little bit about Gimmal if you're not familiar with us. Gimmal started about 20 years ago, so we've been doing this for a long time. The firm actually launched as a consulting organization to help customers understand and figure out how to utilize SharePoint as their records management environment. Since that time, through a series of growth initiatives, both organic and external, we've managed to really diversify our portfolio. So we've got a full suite of information governance tools today. In fact, we think we have the most complete end-to-end governance options available in the marketplace. And one of the key facets of that is we are supporting many different repositories. So oftentimes a vendor specializes in a specific area, for example, Microsoft 365. But we know there's a lot of content outside that needs to be managed and overseen. And we look at a lot of different storage repositories in our tools. So speaking of those tools, just a quick rundown of the products that are available today. The top two are our records management products, Gimmal Records and Gimmal Physical, to help you manage both electronic and paper records from a complete life cycle point of view. In the middle there, we've got Gimmal Discover. We're going to focus primarily on Discover today because it really is our core information governance tool from the standpoint of being able to locate, identify, classify, and manage your electronic content. And you'll learn a lot more about that process as we go through the session today. We've got an e-discovery tool for the desktop called Discovery Attender. We've got a couple of tools that help our clients get to the SharePoint environment to manage content. Gimmal Link allows SAP customers to migrate their information over to SharePoint and preserve the links that might be in an SAP document so that those continue to work once you move out of S/4HANA or one of their repositories. And then Gimmal Migrate is designed to look at legacy document management environments, things like Documentum, and help you port from there to the SharePoint environment as well. So let's talk a bit about where we're headed today from a headlights standpoint. We're going to spend just a few minutes of the presentation talking about the problem itself, the proliferation of data, and some of the risk factors associated with that. And then we'll start to get into really the meat of this, some remediation strategies and how you can manage those from a metrics point of view. And I think that's probably the most valuable part of the presentation as we go along. So let's get started talking about, for today's discussion, our purposes are we're going to focus on data sprawl from the context of documents as opposed to maybe a database kind of a file. And these are files that could be created by your user community, maybe your business units, internal systems, and the like. Our assertion is there's really only three viable reasons to retain that information. From the standpoint of business value, maybe that content in question is relevant to your operation. For example, detail about how a manufacturing process operates, Or in our business, for example, we have to keep information about product backlogs that may eventually turn into features that are promoted into the product at some point. The second reason, of course, is that you're compelled to maintain information due to regulatory oversight. So if you're subject to GDPR or Sarbanes-Oxley, HIPAA, there's a large number of those kinds of regulatory mandates out in the world that we have to comply with. Those are going to determine how long information must be kept and maintained. And then finally, number 3 is your records retention schedule internally for your information. But largely those are powered by 1 and 2. So they really don't have a life cycle outside of being important for your business operation and or regulatory kind of a point of view. What we like to tell people is to remember is you're starting to think about this kind of information and what you need to keep and what can be remediated perhaps, that the legal standards typically are reasonableness, proportionality, and good faith, not perfection. So you don't have to get it completely right as long as you can adhere to those 3 worlds. What we often see in the real world, though, looks a lot more like this pie chart. There's been a significant focus over the last several years on information governance or putting processes in place to manage information. And those efforts have really helped contribute to more disciplined management of the content as represented by the 2 smaller pieces of the pie slices in the chart here. What we find, though, working with our clients is what is often overlooked is that large share of what we're calling dark data. And dark data can be either information you don't know about, for example, a folder and a network file share that an employee who left 5 years ago left behind. Nobody knows that folder's there. Nobody knows what's in it. In fact, it's basically dark. You know what the content is all about. The other facet of that, of course, is information that you don't understand. Maybe it's been created by a specific department or a specific set of users, and you may be aware that it exists, but you don't know the value of that information or if it's something that's important that you need to maintain. The statistics you see on this slide are based from several years ago, but what we found is what's changed in that time is really the proliferation of data sources where this content's being stored. So historically, this has been things like network file shares or local workstations, but now we've got SharePoint, OneDrive, Box, Dropbox, and the list goes on and on, Google Drive, this wide variety of places where all of this dark data and managed content can reside that you need to be cognizant of and put in place some process to manage. Later in the session, Jeff is going to talk about some strategies that you can use to help identify and start to gain insight into that segment of dark data. Quickly, I just like to mention the fact that I'm kind of a watch nerd when it comes to my personal tastes. And this, when I open up my news feed on my phone in the morning, I get these stories about watches flowing in. This one caught my eye because it was such a significant amount of money that was paid. This was a 1965 Rolex Submariner that sold for 230,000 pounds at a UK auction, which is staggering. But unfortunately, our information is not going to appreciate like those rare watches. In fact, this chart is a great visual representation of how quickly, in fact, the value of our information does depreciate. The colored lines represent various categories of information from your business departments, HR, financial, messaging, and so forth, with the time period being tracked across the bottom of the chart and the relative value being tracked on the vertical axis. And you can see how quickly the value of that information deteriorates. And then they've also added those 2 dark lines, the gray and the black line, that also show the cost required to maintain information from a backup point of view and just an IT management expense that's involved with maintaining that content, storage, and so forth. And then the risk, and you can see how that risk line continues to track upwards, especially the longer that that content is maintained. The whole topic of risk is kind of an interesting dimension to this discussion. And our clients have reported that they're seeing risk accelerate in two key areas. First, with regard to regulatory mandates. In the US, at least, more and more jurisdictions are enacting some form of privacy regulation. I think this chart is from earlier this year. So if your organization operates in one of those jurisdictions and you're managing personal data for consumers, employees, partners, and so forth, it's vital that you implement some strict remediation policies to help stay in compliance with whatever that mandate is in your jurisdiction. In some cases, the penalties for these rules that you see popping up on the screen here in green and blue aren't quite as aggressive yet, at least at this point, as GDPR rules in Europe. So the penalties aren't quite as significant, but we're recommending that you still stay in compliance and keep a close eye on these, because as time accelerates, often the financial cost associated with violating one of those regulatory mandates can be significant. There's another side to this coin from a risk point of view, however, that we wanted to make you aware of, and that's really more significant in some respects, and it's this risk of data breaches. So there's been a significant increase in both the number of breaches being reported and the relative cost of a remediation when those breaches occur. These results are from late 2023. I linked to this IBM report in case you're interested. But you can see just by looking at the statistics here, the number of breaches, the number of records breached, and the expense associated with that breach is really significant. And this is just the financial expense with regards to remediation. That could be something as simple as paying a ransom to have your files unlocked, or it could be something more significant, what you have to do to remediate systems, notify customers, perhaps create some kind of remuneration to your customers and so forth. So there's very real and impactful costs that you need to be aware of and cognizant of if you're in a breach situation. And that's not to mention the damage that might be associated with reputation and so forth. So data breaches are the second facet of that severe risk factor that we've been looking at. So the best option that we think is to be a little bit more aggressive, perhaps, with regards to your data remediation. And how would you get started with that kind of a minimization effort? It's almost a foregone conclusion today that we believe most companies have a problem. So it's not so much identifying, do we have a problem, as how do we get started solving the problem? We always recommend starting with a small, more focused project to help build your methodology, then try to take that process and implement it from a starter project. Do any mid-course corrections that you learned during the course of that initial effort, and then turn those over into a larger project moving forwards. Oftentimes that starts with building your business case. And we found that it can be really helpful to use some kind of a business modeling framework or template to sort of plan that out as you're thinking through it from an organization and planning point of view. The canvas that you see here, I've provided a link at the bottom for this one. It's just one example, but it helps you sort of categorize and think about the various questions that need to be answered as you're starting to put that kind of a remediation process in place. One of the most significant ones, we think, is the metrics down in the lower right-hand corner. They're helpful both in getting started from a standpoint of what are we going to get the most, if you will, excuse the phrase, bang for the buck from when we do perform in a remediation or minimization effort. But they're also really useful from the standpoint of figuring out how effective that effort was as you move forward. So I'm going to turn the presentation over to Jeff at this point so he can expand on that idea of establishing and creating metrics, especially using some of our Gimmal products moving forward.
Thanks, Rick. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to talk about Power BI. For those of you who don't know what it is a great analytical tool to provide visual information. So it gives you pie charts, bar charts, what have you. And what I've done is I've actually used Gimmal Discover. I've produced some reports out of our data governance module, including metadata, and then export that report into a CSV file, which is part of the core feature within Discover. and then import or ingest that in the Power BI to be able to show the data in a wide variety of ways. And what Power BI can do is you can actually have different personas. So if the C-suite want to see a set of reports different than HR, different than legal, then you can do all that with Power BI. So taking that basic report out of Discover, you can slice and dice that data to be able to present it to the proper people in the format that they want. So the first thing that we're doing is I actually went through and did a classification on some files within the Windows file path. You'll see that in the title of this. And there are 3 slides here total. I'm going to go through each one of these. But first, what we did is we classified the data based upon, you'll see those classifications in the bar chart here or in the matrix below it. So we had 10 different classifications that we chose. So these are labels that were assigned to the files. Not every file has to have a label, of course. Some people do. Other ones will only label the exceptions like we see here with PII or anything that is a contract, invoice, what have you. So that's your call. You get to choose at what level you want to label. And then what we're showing you on this is just to give some insight. So see on the left-hand side under the path information that roughly 1.5 million files were looked at. And to get an idea of that, about 250,000 of those were labeled. So roughly 1/6, if we do the math here, of the files were labeled on that dark data, as Rick talked about, on a file share. So this is just a particular UNC path on the share that we nominated to be able to go out and look for these different types of data. So we created the criteria for these. Some of this was using keywords, such as contract and invoice, make up different keywords to determine what is a contract and invoice, what's confidential. Other things like the top 2 here, social security number and credit card, we're using regular expressions, which helps you identify patterns in the data to be able to point out that data at risk that is PII identifiable. So you'll see under the processing stats, I'm not going to read you all these lines, but you can see the different things that we have, the number of different extensions, 20 different extensions were found with the UNC path. And then we have some various information like the flags and the images versus text, just to give you some overall statistics. On the next slide, what you're going to see is we're going to show you breaking down these things by pie charts and bar charts. Once again, just to give some insight on this, you'll notice down below the bottom 1 files by extension, that are the files that were actually labeled. So it is showing you the basic extensions, the ones that were most popularly labeled. And you can use that as part of your rot analysis, quite honestly, because one of the things we do with this as well is talk about rot, because classifying, you need to make sure that, as Rick was talking about, just because you have a file that's old doesn't mean that it has no value. So the first thing we always recommend during the rot remediation analysis process is to go out and classify the files. Let's find those files that might be older than the retention period that you're looking at using, such as maybe last modified over the last 10 years. Anything older than that, maybe you consider rot, but you have to also consider the content of that file. So what Discover can do is look at the metadata and or content within these files and be able to assign the appropriate classification label. And then from there, during the rot remediation, we can exclude anything that either has a label at all or on particular labels to make sure they are not remediated during the rot processing. So it gives you, once again, it gives you some nice insight as what types of files are out there. And then on the next slide, which is the last one of the classification, this is called a slicer, and I can't do this in real time since this is a screenshot. But for those of you who are not familiar with Power BI, on the left-hand side, you'll see the classifications, and then below that, the extensions, and then the matrix on taking up most of the frame here. What you can do with these slicers in Power BI is you can select, so I could select confidential and DOCX as an extension, and then the matrix is going to represent only those files that are marked confidential and that are doc files. So it'll just give you some insight, and you can slice and dice this however you want. So this is a really nice way of going through and getting an understanding, what do we have sitting out there, and what kind of a classification label do I want to apply to it? Now, the beauty of all this from a methodology standpoint is, and it might sound daunting, but you can go through your legacy data, but if you do the classification processing, which we highly recommend, you only go through that legacy data once. Because as long as your classification criteria or labels do not change, once we look at a file, then we know what label should be applied, if any label at all. From that point, now once we have the historical legacy data all done, you can go through and say, okay, now I'm going to set up a policy inside of Gimmal Discover that runs once a week only on the deltas, only on files that have been added or modified in the past 7 days. Obviously, that's going to be a much smaller subset than you initially did. So what you could do, as Rick was talking about doing this in pieces, is maybe you start off with saying, you know, we're going to classify anything older than 20 years old. Once we get those done, now between 15 and 20 years old. So you can do this in a nice programmatic methodology so that you have an idea of what you're doing. Because once again, you don't want to tackle this all at once. You want to be able to do this in chunks. Typically, I recommend going after the folders that you know are going to match most of your criteria, because I'll be honest, your criteria is probably going to be iterative. You're probably going to take multiple passes at it. You're going to have some keywords that might be too generic, that are finding things that are false positives. So be patient on that. Realize that you might have to take multiple passes on that initial subset of data just to completely make that in perfection. And then once you have that, then you can take that and roll the scope out to everything else. So that's what we always recommend doing with ROT analysis, is performing the classification first to be able to get those files classified. And now let's, on the next slide, what we're going to do is we're going to go out and we're going to see what do we want to do to the data. So in this one, we set up a 3-year retention policy on files. So this is excluding all the files that were classified. So now we have in 7 different buckets, and you'll see that in the matrix there, 3 to 5 years, 5 to 7, and so on, up to 20 years old, just to get some insight of all the different files we have. And we even broke it down by which ones are images, which ones are text, and you'll see on the right-hand side whether or not they have the protected or the system flag on. So give that matrix some nice viewing to be able to see what you have. And then the one below is just, once again, going by extension to give you, once again, more information, because you can use the extensions as part of your ROT analysis. You have AVI files. Do we use AVI files in business? No, we don't. Well, then why do we have them? We know we can get rid of them. Because with ROT, for those of you who don't know what that acronym means, it's redundant, obsolete, and trivial data. So obviously the trivial portion would be the different extensions. The obsoleteness would be by the age, most likely. And then you'll see on the left-hand side, you're going to see all the statistics again. But then on the next slide, what we're going to show is some charts on all this, so we can see all this information as well. And we're going to get to the duplicates, I promise, which is redundant. We're going to be talking about that a little bit as well. But I wanted to let you see this. And then the next slide, we're doing the same thing we did on the classification, which was to be able to go through and do the slicing on, okay, I want to know about my CSV files that are 10 to 12 years old. And you can see all those and what folders they're in. So once again, this gives you a really good information, and I highly encourage you to use Power BI if you can to be able to make these reports. The last set of reports that I have are for something that we offer here at Gimmal as a free sensitive data assessment. So what does that mean and what's it entail? Well, what it is you would have Gimmal Discover installed in your environment. You would nominate a particular UNC path. We typically recommend something that's not terabytes in size, but something that you feel that you're going to find sensitive data in. So what's sensitive data to this process? It is the credit cards. It is the social security numbers, which we have the regular expressions to help find. I'm going to talk about those in a sec. But then we also have the keywords, which is we allow the client to nominate particular keywords or phrases, and we can do full Boolean expressions on that using ands and ors and phrases and nots, parentheses, exclude, proximity. I'm sure I'm forgetting something. Wildcards as well. You can do all that to find the keyword. So that's the only one that's dynamic. The credit cards and socials, we've actually made up some regex on this that does more than just simply finding a pattern. It's actually a 4-pronged approach. So in addition to the pattern matching, we're also looking for invalid values. For instance, social security numbers can't start with 666, as you can imagine why. None of the components of a social can be all zeros. The socials can't be anything above 77 as the first 2 digits. They haven't been issued yet. So we're doing that kind of analysis on this data. Instead of simply matching the patterns, we're making it be a smart match as well. And then lastly, we're looking at the pattern match, the character immediately preceding and following it. If it is part of a larger pattern, such as another number or maybe another delimiter like a hyphen, then that would be a false positive and we're not going to include it in the process. So what we're doing is we're going out, and this free assessment, for probably your first concern is, what PII data are you going to keep in mind? Because Gimmal Discover is a hybrid SaaS solution, and we have a database in Azure where the data is stored. So fear not, we are not storing PII data. What we're doing is we're binarily, if that's a verb, we're going through and saying, does this file have a credit card? Yes or no? And that's, you'll see that we actually say either found or none. We also collecting the same thing for keywords and socials. We're gathering the extension of the file so we can report on it. We're gathering the creation, modified, and last access date. And we're gathering, actually, that's it. Oh, the extension, I said that. So that's the data that we're getting out of this. We're not storing the folder name. We're not storing the file name. We are not storing the owner of the data. None of that. We're just basically providing as an artifact 6 different reports, and I have 4 of those to show you here, but this being the first one, 6 different reports that we submit back to the client saying, here's the information that we found. So you'll notice on this one, under file information, number of duplicates, where there's our redundant I promise you I'd talk about. So we're going to be seeing that on the last slide on this. But on the next slide, what you're going to see is I chose the modification date. So once again, broke it down in the 10 different buckets, showing you all that in the bar chart, and then down below, giving you an idea of what sensitive data we found by age range. So it gives you all those lovely statistics to be able to get some insight to that. On the next slide, we have files by extension. So once again, taking the extensions. Now, we're not saying these are the only extensions we're checking. We are able to gather every extension out there. I was working with somebody, and believe it or not, they had 5,000 different extensions, which honestly, I didn't realize that many existed. But a lot of them were date times as extensions, but we can gather all of those. So we're not looking for particular extensions. We are looking for any extension out there. And then the next report is the one that is for our duplicates. And you're going to see that in the upper left-hand corner. We found roughly 14,000 dupes. And then what we're showing you here in this report is for each one of these different extensions, how many duplicates we found. So what makes a duplicate? If you notice at the bottom, it says they are determined by a 32-character hex number. And what this is this is a value that represents the content of the file only. If 2 files have different names in different locations with the same content, we consider them duplicates. So this is what it's doing, is going out and producing that hash value, and then we're counting those to find out which ones have more than one. Obviously, one would be unique, but anything that has a more than one match for the hash, we're matching them as duplicates. So I want to talk about, before I go on here, I want to talk about one of the use cases that we did, and I have to anonymize it, but I helped out a client. They were actually going out and doing a email retention policy enforcement. And it's funny because we've been actually, Rick and I both came from one of the acquisitions that Gimmal did called Sherpa Software. And the main thing that we did was email management, was going out and enforcing email retention policies. So we had a client that had Gimmal Discover working on their Exchange on-premises database, mailboxes, excuse me. And they decided to set that aside for a little bit while they migrated to Exchange Online. So they disabled the policies while they were migrating. Took them about 1.5 years to do that. They had roughly 5,000 mailboxes. But then this past fall, I was working with them to get it back up and running again on Discover using M365's mailboxes now instead of on-prem. And to give you some insight, they had a 90-day policy. So what they were doing is after 83 days, every other week, they would move messages to a to-be-deleted folder. And then the following weeks, the odd weeks, they would go out and actually delete those messages from that, giving the user a chance to intervene and say, hey, even though this is older than 83 days, I need to keep that. This is a business record. So it allowed the users to have some empowerment to be able to say, yes, I need this. But what they did, once we reactivated this, and they did their initial deletion for 5,000 mailboxes, over 60 million messages were deleted. So what's the story on this? Rot is also in email because, let's be honest, we're most hoarders some way or another. And email is one of the places where we hoard data. we just forget to delete things. So we can do that process as well. So it's not limited to only what I showed you with Windows File Path. I was just using that as an example of one of the data sources. So here we have on this slide, the free sensitive data assessment that I was talking about. So we get to go out and work with you, and you get to nominate the UNC path. You tell us the keywords you want us to find. Once again, could be an expression as well. And I'm working with 3 right now that are doing this. So they want to go out, and inside their company, they're all championing this. They all think, as Rick was talking about, we have a problem. We know we have data out there that should concern us. So what they're trying to do is to be able to gather some ammunition to say, okay, management, look and see what we found. We did a free sensitive data assessment. We went through and now look at the sensitive data that we were able to find on this. And what that will do then is help propel the whole process so it gets much more attention, because as Rick was talking about, breaches are costly, probably the most costly thing. Now, for any of you who are not in the States and are dealing with GDPR, you also know about the possible fines that could be levied. Rick did show you the map of the states and the different states that are performing retention policy, performing any kind of protection on personal data. So there could be fines levied on that as well. So it's not simply going out and looking at data just to get space back. You need to be concerned about what sensitive data that you have. Okay, I took a long time there to just describe that, Rick, but
no, it was really thorough, Jeff. So we talked about the fact that metrics are important, and I think you demonstrated how critical it is. You can really learn a lot just from gaining that level of metrics back, right?
Absolutely. There's tons of information. You think it looks simple
Yep.
with just looking at a line of data, but you start taking that and aggregate it together. It's very, very important and eye-opening.
Yep, for sure. So folks, we are knee deep in event season right now. In addition to webinars like today's event, we're out and about in a number of physical locations. If you'd like to stop and talk to us live, if you're going to be at any of these events, we would welcome the chance to sit down and have a conversation with you about what Gimmal can do, how we might be able to help you solve whatever information management challenges you're in the throes of. So please feel free to come by and see us if that's the situation. Carla, I think we are turning the presentation back to you at this point.
Yes, thank you so much, Rick and Jeff. We really appreciate you speaking with us today. So we can start Q&A now. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A pod at the bottom of your screen. And I saw we had a few questions throughout the presentation, some being answered, but there's currently a question that asked, so is this basically an access program? And it was asked on like the last slide or the slide before that, if you're able to answer that.
I'm trying to see that question. Access, I think, Sherry, with regards to access, are you talking about access the database? Is that your question?
You can always type another question, Sherry, if you'd like to clarify.
Yeah. So with regards to the information Jeff presented, how we gather and store analytics, and from a database point of view, those are stored in SQL Server databases as opposed to Access. But I'm not quite sure if that was the thrust of the question.
Yeah, we can see if, oh, yes, she said access program that will cross-reference.
Yeah, I think the right answer, Sherry, to your question is it's Microsoft SQL Server that information is being stored in.
Thank you, Rick. We have another question. Do you have any suggestions for classification to emphasize business value rather than avoid breach or cost?
Yeah, Kirsten, it's really specific to your industry in a large part because for example, financial services organization has different requirements than a pharmaceutical. And we work a lot with both of those, so we know those business lines relatively well. And when you get down to that level of detail, what's important in your industry, what we're doing is crafting those analysis criteria that Jeff described when we look at information based to what's going on in your specific industry, so that the classification criteria that we're looking at is specific to the type of compliance or mandates that you might be subject to.
Yeah, and to add to that, Rick, Kirsten, those labels that you're applying you have carte blanche to those. They can be anything you want them to be. So we're not forcing upon you particular labels or the number of those. That is at your discretion.
She added a note. She said, might duplicates reflect value?
Maybe, or
Right.
or I think I stored this somewhere, but I don't remember where, and I'm just going to put it somewhere else. Possibly. I mean, what you could also do, obviously, is go through and make a criteria of which one wins. Not to say one's a loser. That sounds a little harsh to a file, but which
Right.
one is the winner of the process and which other ones are duplicates that we can delete. So that's going to be at your criteria too. Maybe it's the last modified one wins, but that's going to be up to you to answer.
Thank you, Jeff.
David,
We have,
I see David's question about
yeah.
migration. So David, we don't support in any of our products today Viva that I'm aware of. However, what we could perhaps help you do is figure out what information on your legacy repository is important to migrate to either that archiving platform or your document management system like Viva, and then sequester it someplace, in a kind of a holding location, if you will, so that now this is the subset of data that I have to move over to that platform. And I'm not familiar with Viva other than the name, but there may be an import facility. Once we've done that, we've created a subset of data that's important to migrate to be able to use their import tools to be able to do that, perhaps.
Yeah, and add on to that, Rick, I would advise not just doing a lift and shift. If you can go through and perform your rot analysis remediation prior to moving it. I mean, the analogy I always use is you buy a new house, you don't take everything in your old house and put it into the new house. You clean stuff out and throw it away before you do that.
Yeah.
So I'd advise the same kind of thing for this, is to go through, and you'd be surprised. I think Rick showed a slide that had 30% of rot data, and that was not including the dark data that was out there. There's a lot of data that is probably not needing to be migrated.
Thank you both. Thank you both. Sorry, I wasn't sure if I was muted there. But we have another question referring to the framework business case slide. We're starting on our first big data cleanup initiative. Based on your experience, what are some common challenges organizations face in areas we should make sure to spend time on?
Wow, the big question. So building your team is often a primary thing to focus on as you get started, because you're going to need representation from across the organization typically. Somebody from the business side who understands what that information is all about and why it was created to begin with, perhaps. Somebody perhaps from, if you don't have an in-house legal department, maybe you've got outside counsel that you work with, somebody from the legal side to give you any feedback with regards to compliance issues you need to be aware of. Hey, we can't remove this because of a Sarbanes-Oxley requirement, or answer those kinds of legal questions. Certainly somebody from your leadership staff who's going to be able to help you understand what budget's available to perform this kind of an evaluation, because that might largely impact how much you're able to accomplish, or where you're going to start, or how effective it can be going forward. So I would say team building initially is the main thing to focus on, and then being able to sort of gather some of the metrics that Jeff described to help inform those people that are on your team. All right, here's maybe the extent or the scope of our problem, because that will give you some insight into the best areas to start.
And here's another thing you can do too, is you can go out and determine who the data owner is. I mean, if there's some structure, for instance, on your file share, you know who owns the data instead of IT trying to make decisions, which I wouldn't advise, of, hey, we're just going to go ahead and delete all these things older than a certain time period. You can actually delegate that responsibility out to the data owners because they're making a much more informed decision than IT will be because they're familiar with the data, like Rick said.
Great, thank you both. If there aren't any more questions, thank you so much again to Rick and Jeff for being with us this afternoon. I want to thank all of our participants as well who joined us today. We hope this webinar has been helpful for you and your organization.